Hello, hello. I'm so honored to be here with you to speak about resilience today and to be with my honored colleagues. And as you know, we're speaking about resilience at a time when we need it very, very much. Next slide. So the title of my talk is Building Multi-Stakeholder Relationships for Resilience in Healthcare. But you'll see it's more than healthcare, but healthcare is an important focus of my talk today. Next, please. So yes, what are the challenges we face? I think it's pretty clear we live in a highly interdependent world, socially, economically, environmentally, evolutionarily, and I think even emotionally interdependent, wherever we are, we seem to be affected by what's happening to other people. And our challenges are increasingly complex with multiple stakeholders involved, and sometimes they're global in nature, as with the recent COVID pandemic and with the climate change. So my argument is that leaders really need to recognize and manage this interdependence, and that relationships are essential for managing this interdependence. Next, please. So today I'm going to talk about what is relational coordination. How does it help us to develop resilience? How can we bring multiple stakeholders together to build relational coordination for greater resilience? And what leadership capacities will be needed for that? Next, please. So two of the industries that I talk about today are the airlines and healthcare, and I've written about both of them. Next, please. Starting with airlines, which is where I first developed this theory, I studied the flight departure process, which is a coordination challenge. I found there were 12 different groups that needed to coordinate their work in order to achieve high performance. And I also learned that it was not easy for the people involved, in part because the structures were designed to keep them in their own silos and not very well designed to help them coordinate across. Next, please. So what I came to understand is that relationships shape the communication through which coordination occurs. Next. And that can happen, next. That can happen in a very positive way when the people in those different groups are connected by shared goals, shared knowledge of each other's work, and a mutual respect for each other's work. And that tends to drive sufficiently frequent, timely, accurate problem-solving communication. So that is very positive relational coordination. But, next slide, I often found instead of that, people were trapped in their functional goals with exclusive knowledge and lack of respect, perceived lack of respect for their work. The communication was insufficiently frequent, often delayed, inaccurate, and more focused on finger pointing than problem solving. And that tended to reinforce functional goals, exclusive knowledge, and lack of respect. So next, please. I called this process relational coordination and defined it as communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. So my view is it's very easy to understand, and it's difficult to do it very often at work. Next, please. So I decided to study this. This is when I was a student at MIT many years ago. I did a study of flight departures over 12 months of operation at 4 US airlines, Southwest, American, Continental, and United. I measured their quality and efficiency performance outcomes. I did some good statistical adjustment for the differences in their product. And my big contribution was to measure relational coordination using a network measure among pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, ticket agents, baggage, ramp, freight, all the different groups that I showed in that network map. Next, please. And what I found, this is a visual representation of the findings, is that the airline operations that had high levels of relational coordination also had high levels of quality and efficiency performance. And that was a pretty consistent relationship. And you can see that one of the Southwest sites that I studied in Chicago was the highest performing in my study. It was also the best, Chicago was the best site for Southwest in their organization. But you can also see there's some variation within an airline. American had 2 of the sites with different performance. United had very different performance for all 3 of the sites that I studied. Next, please. I decided when I was in the middle of this study and I went to the hospital to give birth to my daughter Rose, that patient care was also a big coordination challenge, as many of you already knew that. And so I decided to study that next. Next, please. I did a 9-hospital study of surgical patients. I measured quality and efficiency performance, also job satisfaction, and adjusting for differences in the patients. Again, the statistical adjustment for differences. And again, measured relational coordination among doctors, nurses, physical therapists, social workers, case managers. Next, please. And I found here, and these were hospitals in Dallas, Boston, and New York City. All with very high volumes of joint replacement patients, so it was possible. And they're all very high performing hospitals. But what I found was a lot of variation in relational coordination, and that was responsible for or explained a lot of variation in quality and efficiency performance. So research has continued since then. Next, please. Across many sectors. The commercial sector, anywhere from accounting to airlines to venture investment and telecommunications, the human service sector, education sector, but probably the most work has been done in healthcare. And you can see, as we have representatives today from intensive care and emergency care, all of those subsectors have been studied with relational coordination. And next, please. You can see also there's been a lot of exploration of these topics in different countries around the world. Next, please. So what have we found? Next. What we found is that there are a larger number of performance outcomes of being able to coordinate work well. Coordination leads to better outcomes for quality and safety, efficiency and financial outcomes, the ability to engage our clients. That was actually a finding from a French study of the banking sector by Loic Play. And worker well-being, as you'll see, has been very much associated with relational coordination. Finally, learning and innovation, that when we coordinate our work through relational coordination, it is a benefit for learning and innovation. Next, please. So here are the outcomes that we have found in a systematic review that was just published. Quality outcomes have been studied most, 222 different findings. And 80% of those findings have been consistent with the theory, meaning that relational coordination leads to significantly higher quality outcomes in 80% of the findings. Efficiency outcomes, less studied, only 31 findings, and only 68% of those findings have been consistent with the theory, where relational coordination significantly predicts a higher efficiency. The rest are mostly insignificant. Worker well-being has been very consistent, 87%. Learning and innovation, the most consistent with 90% of the findings. So that's where we are so far with the state of the knowledge about relational coordination and performance outcomes. Next, please. So just a few examples. A study of relational coordination for nurses in rural hospitals. It was found that relational coordination significantly improves their engagement, their satisfaction with their work, and reduces their burnout. And that is their relational coordination with all of the other functions as they experience it as nurses. Next, please. A second example is a study of outpatient surgical units, and that's at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Hospital System. RC significantly associated with improved engagement, satisfaction, and reduced burnout. And this was for surgeons, nurses, technicians, and secretaries. Everyone who worked on these surgical units had their well-being positively, each of the work groups had their well-being positively influenced by relational coordination, shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect. Next, please. So why? I think it's because having good coordination with other people allows you to achieve better outcomes for your patients or customers with less wasted effort, less stress, and therefore less burnout. Because instead of working on your own against other people, you're working together in the same direction. And so the same work effort leads to more positive outcomes, not so much wasted effort. And I think that is a very important source of well-being for us as workers. Next. Also, we know from the work of Deming that you need a certain culture to support process improvement, learning, and innovation, and that having aligned goals, understanding each other's work, and respecting each other's work is the kind of culture that supports process improvement and therefore learning and innovation. And then looking at the neurological level, we also know that positive relationships evoke positive emotions, which activates a more advanced part of our brain and thus supporting learning and innovation. So at many different levels, we can understand why the findings have been fairly consistent, particularly for learning and innovation and well-being. And more broadly, just to look at this at the multi-stakeholder level, you can see how having shared goals, shared knowledge, and mutual respect could help many diverse stakeholders connect around the work that they need to do together. And the following picture on the next slide shows how that is. So you have very different areas of expertise on this map. But what they have in common are the patients that they are working with together. And what relational coordination enables is for people in these different groups to understand and see the interdependence and see the work that they're doing together because they're sharing the goals, they're understanding each other's roles, and they're respecting each other's work, which enables frequent, timely, accurate problem-solving communication. So that's why that's kind of the basic understanding of what is relational coordination. Next, please. So the question now is, how does it create resilience? You know, it's not obvious. Just because it helps us coordinate our work under quote-unquote normal circumstances doesn't tell us how it creates resilience. So let's look at that. So one thing we know about pressure that we experience in work or in life, that it can cause at first our performance to go up because we have to meet the new challenges. And that's kind of the nature of resilience. As the pressure goes up, we are able to perform to meet those challenges. But after a certain point, as that pressure continues, it leads to strain and then crisis and then a decline in performance if the pressure continues to grow beyond our capacity. So the question is, if you look at that green arrow, that is really the space we want to be in, where we are stretching. But what gives us the capacity to stretch for under greater pressure? And I'll suggest in the next slide that high quality relationships are one of the things that allows us to do that. That with relational coordination or other ways of looking at high quality relationships, we're able to take that, the pressure that comes and respond in a productive way for a longer stretch of, for a greater range of pressure. And so we're basically increasing resilience with high quality relationships. And I would suggest that's particularly true when the pressures that we face are about interdependent things that we have to address together as a group, not something that we can just do on our own. But as we know, even if there's a challenge that we have to face on our own, there's a lot of evidence that high quality relationships are helpful for that too. But particularly when there's a large collective challenge that we need to solve, having high quality relationships in the form of relational coordination gives us that resilience to do it better under pressure. So here's a study of that in the US healthcare context, where we were looking at different health systems that were experiencing different pressures from a new payment system called managed care. And as that pressure went up, there was a higher managed care penetration in some states relative to others. It predicted higher levels of worker stress and the belief by workers that it was very hard to do their work because of the lack of resources. That led to higher levels of relational coordination among the workers who had more stress. They actually coordinated their work better, and that led to higher performance. But the really big finding for me was that this didn't happen all by itself. Rather, that relational coordination was highly supported by the presence of organizational structures. So even more than stress creating coordination, those structures were necessary to support a productive response to these external pressures. That was my takeaway. And looking at the next slide, what are those organizational structures? Well, part of the theory of relational coordination is that in order to have these kinds of relationships that are productive and highly coordinated, we need to move away from the traditional bureaucratic structures that basically enable us to do very well within our area of expertise. And we need instead to create structures, design structures, and implement structures that enable us to connect across our areas of expertise in order to meet the challenges that we face. And some of those include selecting people for their teamwork capacities, training them further for teamwork capacities, creating job designs where it's clear how your responsibility relates to everybody else's responsibility. What are your coordination responsibilities in your job? Thirdly, shared accountability and rewards, that your accountability and your rewards are not just for doing your specific job, but for achieving the overall outcomes of the network that you're working in. So, and that one is, I'm not showing the research findings here, but that is one of the strongest findings, is shared accountability and rewards helps to support relational coordination. Relational leadership, I'll come back to that. Boundary spanner roles, people whose actual job is to coordinate among other people. The presence of shared meetings and huddles. These are things we're very familiar with, shared protocols, shared information systems, and it can be helpful to have a shared space, even if sometimes it's virtual, but a shared space where people can come together and meet. And those structures help to support RC, which support the outcomes. And I would say, even though they're very, very useful in a crisis, it's even more helpful if you can build them before the crisis comes. And we'll come back to that. Next, please. So why does it matter for crisis? There's an interesting paper that just came out by Ingrid Nembard, Larry Burns, and Steve Shortell about responding to COVID-19, lessons from management research, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But they talk about the example of COVID-19 and say crises like COVID-19 require coordinated responses amidst uncertainty by teams that cross multiple functions and roles. Effective teamwork hinges on accurate, frequent, timely problem-solving communications, bolstered by shared goals, shared knowledge, and mutual respect, requirements that are collectively called relational coordination. Here's the key. Many caregivers likely have not worked together previously or not worked together under complex conditions, the circumstances when relational coordination matters most. So that is the challenge that we face, how to build this capacity before a crisis comes, or even in the midst of a crisis if necessary. Next, please. What they say further is that what we've already learned here, relational coordination is achieved, for example, through shared meetings and protocols, huddles, identification of boundary spanners, and shared conflict resolution strategies. It also requires that people feel safe to ask questions, raise concerns, offer suggestions, an environment that is not always found among healthcare workers. As we know, healthcare workers span many different levels of status, from, I would say, physicians to patient care assistants, and those differences of status can make it very difficult to have an open exchange of ideas. But if you can build it, that fosters quality and safety outcomes, bridges differences, and fosters learning and innovation. And those were all goals of a COVID-19 response. So let's look at this next question. How do we prepare your organization to respond with resilience when a crisis comes? Next. So 6 stages of change is that we explore the context, we create a change team, measure RC, how are we doing, reflect on the findings, design interventions, that is the critical thing, and then we implement and assess. So look at each one briefly, explore the context. Next. These will be, learn more about this process of change in these 2 books. The Relational Analytics comes out in June. The context, what is the situation in which we find ourselves? What are the challenges we have for coordination? Who, most importantly, are the key stakeholders who are involved in facing those challenges together? Next. We then create a change team that represents ideally every key stakeholder in the process, and then we have to motivate those stakeholders who come from very different perspectives and very different power to contribute their effort to a change process. We have to facilitate discussions and create a safe space for them to disagree respectfully so we get full information from each of their perspectives, because each stakeholder is going to have a different point of view that is valuable to understand in order to solve the challenge. And we have found it is very useful to engage in relational mapping to visualize the work to be done. So I'll show a picture of that. Next, here's a picture in a hospital setting where people are mapping out who are the different stakeholders, how strong are their ties. It's very similar to the map that we saw earlier, that network map. And they're doing it specifically for their own work to understand. Those red lines mean that's a challenge. We do not do this very well right now. That could be a risk. If you were doing a risk assessment, the red would be something to really focus on. Next. Here's a group doing it for their whole community around mental health services in San Francisco in this case. And you see again, there are red lines. The blue means moderate, medium level of coordination. Red means we think it's a real problem. Green means it's really strong. On this map at the community level, there's no strong ties that I can see right now. Next. So next, I mean, that mapping is good because it helps the change team really visualize what it is we're trying to coordinate and where the capacities that we need to develop. But it can actually be helpful to measure this with a network tool to assess coordination more accurately and more inclusively with everyone who's involved, not just those people at the table. It takes about 20 minutes to complete, often typically less actually, and the results then can be shared for designing interventions in an inclusive process. Next, here are the 7 questions on the survey, and each one gets asked about each of the groups in the network so that you end up with a network map. Next. So here are the findings. This is a way of looking at the results where you say, how are we doing on frequency? How are we doing on timeliness? How are we doing on accuracy? You can see here for this particular healthcare process, where are the challenges that they have most? The only real area of strength they have is that they communicate frequently, but we know that's not enough for achieving our outcomes just to be frequent. Next. Looking at those same results in a network map, you can see the care coordinator here on the green circle is doing pretty well with the coordination, but not maybe as well as a care coordinator should, not coordinating very well with the administrative. You can see anyway, the orange is suggesting that there are areas of improvement. Even the blue ties would probably work better for outcomes if they were green. So you can see from looking at the survey, and there's more detailed information behind this. Next, please. This can also be done at the community level. Here is a community that was experiencing issues with youth violence, and they brought together all these different parties, including the youth advocates themselves, faith communities, economic development, government, to resolve and to understand how is our collaboration going and how can we do it better. Next, please. So the next phase, after you really understand where are our challenges with relational coordination, is to start to design interventions. We've looked at structures, but one thing we have found, and this really comes out of some of my many conversations with Edgar Schein and Amy Edmondson, is that structures by themselves are not sufficient to create change. You first need to create an environment where you have strong enough relational coordination that people know how to build those structures. So we typically start with relational interventions, and then we include work process interventions. Relational interventions are creating psychological safety, engaging in humble inquiry as leaders to get different voices into the room, and participate in relational mapping and measurement so we can all start to see together how we're doing. Next, please. So a way of explaining this is relational interventions are ways to create, are intended to create new ways of working together. Structural interventions help to support and sustain those new ways of working together. Structures are very important. If you have the old structures, the old bureaucratic ones, you will lose. It will be hard to sustain your way of working together. And finally, work process interventions, whether we're talking about Lean or Six Sigma or Plan, Do, Study, Act, all those methodologies are very useful for using those new ways to working together to improve performance. So to take our relational capabilities and actually improve our performance outcomes using work process interventions. Thank you. And then finally is stage 6, which is simply implementation and then assessing the results. Is like any cycle of improvement, the change team implements the interventions that they've designed in partnership with their colleagues, and then they assess the progress by periodically assessing how are we doing on this and how are our performance outcomes changing. So that's just a summary of the 6 stages of change, but I want to have a big caveat in the next slide is that crisis inevitably creates change, but it makes it very challenging to engage in intentional change, right? Everything's changing around you, but implementation and periodic assessment of interventions can be very hard during a crisis. I'm working with several healthcare organizations right now, from a small community health center to a huge network of health systems on the West Coast. And they feel that they are in crisis just because there are so many challenges right now for health systems, and they're working hard to create intentional change, but it takes a lot of work when everything is an emergency, and it's hard to stop and pause and invest the resources that you need to turn around what could become a downward spiral. So what my argument, and this is very consistent with Deming and Out of the Crisis, a classic work, and that wasn't 2018, that was a lot, the original work was much earlier. Leaders have to stop, invest time and resources in the improvements process in order to stop the downward spiral and regain performance in a crisis time of crisis. And that is very challenging, as we know. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other speakers have to say about that. Next. So what kind of leadership is needed? This is my final kind of question that I asked up front is, what are the leadership capacities needed to build relational coordination for resilience in times of crisis? And one way to look at this is relational leadership. If relationships are essential for managing interdependence and responding to a crisis in a timely, accurate, problem-solving way, then you need leaders who are going to be able to foster the development of those relationships among coworkers, which we call relational coordination, and with the citizens or patients that they serve, and we call that relational co-production, when you're engaging in that process with the people that you're actually serving. And that would be the case in a community response effort, when you need your citizens to be working with you in order to respond to the crisis. Next, please. So what do relational leaders do? My colleague Tony Suchman from Relationship Centered Healthcare makes the argument that To be a relational leadership, the most important things are that you have to be the change that you wish to see. You have to role model that change. You can't use the old culture to create the new one. Secondly, you have to make sure that you're engaging your colleagues in doing the work for themselves and not just doing it for them as the leader. And third, that you use these principles of relational coordination, shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect, and these measures of relational coordination to open up conversations, not to close them down. Because behind every RC principle, timely communication, is a question. What's timely for you? Or accurate? What would make this more clear and easy for you to understand? What would make this more accurate? Problem solving. How can we engage in problem solving rather than blaming by understanding each other's work? So behind every RC principle is a question rather than an answer. It has to be worked out among the stakeholders themselves. Next. And then finally, what do relational leaders do? I basically asked the healthcare leaders that take my relational coordination masterclass, and once they understand what I'm talking about, they're all able to relate to it because everyone in some ways has tried to be a relational leader, and so, or has observed others do it really well. So when I ask, what do relational leaders do? I get a lot of different responses, but these are some of them. They're clear. They say exactly what they mean. They can have a conflict, then resolve it and move beyond it and continue working together. Very importantly, they work to understand the perspective of everyone else. They make decisions through consultation with the people who are being affected, what we can call fair process. They do a lot of non-judgmental listening, which can help them figure out the perspective of others. They adjust their decisions based on what they've heard. They are authentic. They are themselves. They show respect to others in a consistent way. They show vulnerability in order to create a safe space and to say, yes, we can all come together here and learn because I'm not perfect and no one has to be perfect, but we all have to be working to get better. And finally, they create the time and resources to do improvement, even when times are very stressful, to looking for the time and space to improve how we're doing our work together so that we can engage in an upward spiral of resilience rather than a downward spiral of decline. So I think that's it, and I would love to ask one final question for you in the final slide. And that is just to reflect to yourself, how would this work in your organization? Because obviously every organization is different. And in some it might be, we already do this. We do this even better than you are describing. Or at the other extreme, it could be this would never work. Just even trying to do this would mean that I would become an outcast in my organization. I would no longer be respected because people do not see this way. So there's probably somewhere in between, you're completely doing it or it's completely unacceptable to work in a relational way to achieve performance and resilience. We're probably, many of us, our organizations are some way in between. I know mine are. So I welcome, as we get into the discussion and now hearing from other colleagues first, any questions or ideas you might have. Thank you.